Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 101. Steve and Tony. For nothing. It had all been for nothing. That thought kept circling in Steve's head even as he stomped away from Sam and headed for his floor. It circled as he grabbed the uniform and gave it a titanic, almost hateful glower before yanking it on. It circled as he stomped into his boots. It made him taste the bile in the back of his throat. It only went silent when he grabbed his shield. Because, like hell, was he going to let it stay that way? One way or another, Hydra would die. Even if it was the last thing Steve did, even if he had to spend the rest of his life hunting them down like the roaches they were, he would not, could not, let everything he, the Commandos, and the SSR had done be for nothing. He would not let that be his or their legacy. He'd never been able to just stand back and let the bullies win, even when he'd been a 90-pound asthmatic. He for sure wasn't going to call that fight quits now. As he made his way out of his apartment, floor, whatever, part of him wanted to be mad at Coulson and the rest of the team for keeping this from him. The rest of him recognized that they'd probably done the right thing. At least this way, he'd gotten 2 decent nights of sleep before kicking some tail. He was able to think better. Well, sort of. He was mad enough to make him lean more towards what Bucky would have called dumb stunts than sane practical tactics. This once, he didn't think that was going to be too much of a problem. He got a few surprises when he walked into Tony's penthouse, which was where everyone had assembled, according to Jarvis, when he belatedly remembered to ask as he hadn't specified where to meet. Hadn't really known where to tell the truth. He'd have to remember to ask if there was something specific set aside. They couldn't use the penthouse every time. And by where everyone had assembled, Steve meant everyone, including John, who was wearing a black leather outfit like those the X-Men had worn during the invasion, and that Steve assumed Tony had gotten the design for at some point. Oddly, John wasn't flicking the lighter that Steve knew was as much a part of him as his arm. But then John flicked his hand, and a little ball of flame popped into his hand. When it winked out, Steve caught a glimpse of something in John's palm, probably some ignition system Tony had cooked up. Sam Wilson was there, which surprised Steve with an odd-looking backpack on his back and goggles on his head. It took Steve a minute to remember what the heck the deal was there. Oh, right, mechanical wings that Sam flew on with only standard-issue body armor for protection, which officially made him crazier than Tony in Steve's books. Steve cocked an eyebrow at Sam. Guess you decided to sign up for this? Hell yes. Someone needs to keep an eye on your ass. No insult to him intended. Sam motioned to the other surprise in the room. Bucky, who was wearing the Winter Soldier getup. The mask was off, but sitting on a side table nearby, and had a gun the size of a house leaning against his leg. But there was none of the dead-eyed soldier in the man now wearing that outfit. A man who flashed a sign at him that made Steve's heart skip a few beats. End of the line. Soldier had not showed any signs of knowing about that. Something that had predated their days in the war. Recognizing Steve, yes. Remembering specific events or often used phrases. Never mind his own name, not so much. Steve glanced from Bucky to Coulson, wide-eyed, hardly daring to hope. Evidently, Hydra was a key word for a good chunk of his memory. Coulson said. He says he doesn't have everything back still, but evidently everything that predates the war is back. The shield hit the ground with a thunk, and Steve headed straight for Bucky, who, much to Steve's relief, didn't hesitate even a second at seeing the hug coming. Punk, Bucky said when they pulled back apart. Steve had never heard anything more wonderful in his life. You jerk! He ground out, trying desperately to not cry. It took him a minute and a couple deep breaths to pull it back together. Steve didn't bother asking if Bucky was sure. They'd both follow each other into hell if it came to that. Part of him wanted to order Bucky to stay behind. Not sure he could handle having Bucky in the field with him. Not sure he could handle risking losing Bucky again. But if there was anyone who owed those bastards a few rounds of pain, it was Bucky. And as much as Steve wanted to swaddle Bucky and got him batting and lock him up somewhere safe, he knew he couldn't. Tony, clad in a suit that looked like it had just come off the assembly line. It probably had. Steve knew the other had gotten banged up and the suitcase one wasn't armored enough for sustained combat. Said, Jay, let's show him the targets. Immediately, 4 satellite images sprang up. Along one side of the images were latitude and longitude markings, civilian population density of the area, weather forecasts, and the number of Hydra in each facility. What security measures each had, and what exactly Hydra was doing with each location. Interestingly enough, the civilian population section was at 0 for each of the 4 sites. 3 were what looked on the surface like small private airports tucked away in remote corners of the world. The 4th was a big old castle. There's more than these 4, but these are the first ones we found that didn't have innocent civvies we'd have to work around, Tony said, teeth flashing in a very unfriendly grin. I figured you might want to, shall we say, send a message, and a quiet surgical strike lacks something in the message department. Yeah, Tony would know something about sending messages, wouldn't he? He'd send a darn big one to the people who'd kidnapped him. Might not hurt to take a page out of that book. And with Bucky in the soldier get-up, Steve was betting Bucky had a similar idea. Hydra couldn't know they had no hope of regaining control of him, so they'd think they could turn him on the Avengers. And when that failed spectacularly, Steve couldn't quite repress the nearly evil grin that thought brought on. Bruce? He asked. Bruce gave him a quiet smile. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't willing to let Hulk join the party. He said, he's got to learn to fight with you guys somehow. This might be the best way, at least until he understands things like training. Yeah, that one had kept Steve thinking after the meet-up with Hulk on Asgard. Hulk wasn't stupid, but he had rather understandable issues where violence was concerned. It'd probably be a while before he didn't immediately assume the worst of any apparent violence in his vicinity. Of the 4, the castle was the most remote. Out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, surrounded by forest. The nearest neighbors were a good 10 or 15 miles away in Bavaria. Something about that tweaked Steve's memory, so he tapped at the picture. The other 3 shrank down, and the castle expanded, a larger and more detailed file opening beside it. Including the name of the place. And who owned it. Well, talk about your targets that send a message. It didn't get much better than blowing up the house of the guy who'd helped fund Red Skull. Among other things, Steve had never seen Strucker on the battlefield, but the bastard had been eyeball deep in Hydra. They'd suspected he'd at least been housing Hydra agents, if not had an actual base in his basement, somewhere even during the war. So it wasn't a surprise there was a base there now. It's actually in use? Steve asked. Yeah, refuge in Audacity, we think. Surely Hydra, if it still exists, wouldn't use this place as a base. Too obvious. The use is fairly new, last decade or so. It was empty before that. Probably wanted to give people enough time to start to forget. Tony offered. Strucker's still knocking around too. Supposed to be there all this week from what Jarvis found. Steve nodded. Right. We start at the top and work our way down. I want every nook and cranny checked. Places like this always have secret passages, and someone could backtrack and get behind us if we don't know where they are. I got that covered. Cap. Lots of spy eyes and Jarvis. Tony said, and they. He motioned to Coulson, the science squad, minus Bruce, of course, Darcy, and Rogue. We'll be on grounds watching our backs. Steve nodded. I want Strucker alive, if at all possible. If anyone will know about Hydra, it'll be him. Unsaid, but from the looks on everyone's faces, understood, was that literally everyone else in the place was expendable, unless, of course, they were clearly a captive of some stripe. Given the obsession with recreating himself, Steve would have put it past Strucker to have his own attempts running, complete with unwilling subjects. Loki, I want you, Clint, and Natasha working the shadows. Hit where they can't see you coming and sow confusion. Tony, Thor, Sam, You three are on their exterior security and our air support. Knock them out and keep them down no matter what. John, you're with me and Bucky. James, you and Remy pair up. Bruce, you stay with the jet until we've got the place cleared of people or hulks needed, whichever happens first. That ensured there was at least one long-range fighter and one short-range with each group. He'd mix up the groups if he had to on future missions to figure out what worked best. Once we're sure we have all the people one way or another, Steve fairly growled, and all the information we can get out of their computers and any paper files. Well, that'll be up to those of you with a heavy firepower, but I want that place to be nothing more than ash on the wind when we're done. As for you, you jerk, Steve said, scowling at Bucky. He didn't say anything else. He really didn't need to. The titanic scowl Bucky was sporting said enough for the both of them. Message sent and received. They'd be sticking to each other like glue. Tony was more than a little alarmed here. Steve was... yeah, that expression? Not comforting. Tony didn't even know how to classify that look other than as... terrifying! They were going to play hell keeping up with him and keeping him from getting himself killed, though Barnes might help more than expected. He'd been surprised when Coulson had filled them in after Steve called the meeting. Barnes might not be talking much yet, more than before, but still not much, but he'd made it real clear that where Steve went, he went, and Tony had seen the footage of the shooting range. He hadn't gone all soldier the moment he touched a gun. Though honestly, in this case, Tony didn't think Barnes going soldier would actually be a problem. Even before most of his memory had booted back up, he'd been protective of Steve. Tony didn't see that changing. Ever. The man had responded to Steve even with 99% of his brain fried to ash. You couldn't buy, beg, or borrow that sort of loyalty. At least Steve was the sort who could think coherently even when he was so pissed he couldn't see straight. But then that sort of figured. The guy could come up with workable plans even when he had to pull everything out of his flag-glad ass. Like that first attempt to save Barnes. Steve hadn't known anything about where Barnes was except for there were other captured soldiers there and a ton of Hydra. He'd still come out on top. In point of fact, the only time he'd ever lost a fight in the war was that plane. Even Barnes's laws hadn't made him lose the train mission. And given the circumstances, Tony wasn't the only one since then to wonder if that perhaps hadn't been deliberate. Steve would hardly be the first to just give up after one loss too many. However heretical that line of thinking generally was in regards to Steve, because seriously, bringing up the possibility of that having been a suicide run got people frothing at the mouth faster than near anything else. They had to wait a bit for Clint and Natasha to get the jet. Tony made due mental note to just keep the jet here and to take up most of the roof, but there was nothing for it. They were going to be in and out way too much for a while to get a Quinjet from S.H.I.E.L.D. every time they needed one. All that said, this was going to be fun. Hydra was going to piss its collective pants just having Barnes coming at them in full soldier regalia, especially when they figured out they couldn't regain control of him, at least not as easily as they assumed they could anyway. Bless Frigga for making sure all that shit was out of Barnes's head. They could always regain control of him the hard way, but Tony would love to see them try. That would end extremely badly for Hydra, because Steve would burn them to the ground single-handedly to get Barnes back if Hydra ever recaptured him. Having the rest of the Avengers coming down on them? Some might say that was overkill, but Tony had always thought that overkill was just kill enough. If you blasted the other guy back to the Stone Age, you couldn't exactly get back up and cause you trouble in any kind of hurry. If he got up at all!